Okay, hi. I cannot believe it's been 2 weeks already. Holy man, I gotta get on this. I gotta fix my sound. Sound there. Um, basically, I am set to watch the show tomorrow with um with you know here at home. So um I gotta finish this tonight. Oh, still too sensitive. Uh, trying. Okay, sorry. All right, so first of all, I'd like to give credit to the art. This is actually from the video game Guardians of Middle Earth, which is like a League of Legends of Lord of the Rings that was kind of ill-fated, but I tried it and it was mid. Anyways, it's okay. uh, it's okay. I'm not gonna get into that. It was a MOBA, and Um, so today, I got to finish the history of Galadriel and Celeborn, and what I'd also like to do is get into some um, David Day stuff. David Day, if you don't know, has created a phenomenal book series on Tolkien's Middle Earth. Made the Battle of the Battles of Tolkien, the Heroes of Tolkien, the Hobbits of Tolkien, um, the Dark Powers of Tolkien. Basically, a good source for everything you really need to know in about the world of Middle Earth. Encyclopedia of Tolkien, a dictionary of Tolkien. That on top of the complete guide to Middle Earth. I should actually have gotten all the books I wanted to go over today before the show starts tomorrow. And I kind of go episode by episode every night. So yeah, tomorrow night I'm going to be giving a review of episode 1 and um kind of explain what I want from it when I watch it, because I'm not going to be a purist. And I'll clarify this tomorrow. I don't want to I'm same with the Peter Jackson Lord of the Rings movies. The events were different, but in the Rings of Power, I want the spirit of the events to be genuine. Like Galadriel was, as you can tell from last video, is an extremely dramatic character in the setting of Middle Earth as a whole. She's probably the most influential character, period. And um I want to just I would love for the show to hone in on that. It's like wasted potential if they don't hone into her whole quest for redemption, and you know the whole thing about the Smith being fooled by Anatar, and going under Galadriel's nose, and everything like that, and the relation with the Numenorians and all such things. And we're gonna learn today about Amroth, and I don't know if Amroth's gonna come into the show at all, um, or either of her kids. I don't know if they're gonna come into the show, but we'll see. Um, and I keep being cautious about it. I was gonna watch it today, but I wanted to do this first. Um, but I keep being told oh, don't judge before you watch it, and I keep seeing people who I like to watch complain about it, but I know for a fact no one is really a Tolkien nerd really anymore, or a lot of people forget things or just lose interest. I know I lost interest for a while there, because of other factors of that movie and other things. But I love this universe to death. Tolkien made a phenomenal world, which isn't just a bunch of lore dumps. It's all such good drama built into a history that he's put his life into, and um, he's very takes his themes and his world very seriously in a dramatic way, and that's something that um, I've learned that writers should be doing is um, not take you don't need to take um, yourself seriously, like lighten up and all that stuff, but you need to take the fantasy of your world seriously so that readers can, loosen up a bit in that regard and engage, I guess. Um, yeah, and that's a challenge with purist fans. Very neurotic. They've honed in a bit too much on that term, but um, when there's a lot to sink your teeth into, you don't want it. You want each great thing to have it today. You know what I mean? And this is if they screw up Galadriel, they screw up a lot. How do you do a story of Numenor if you have a backdrop of Galadriel? I don't know. I'm gonna do the research on the show later. For now, enough preamble. I should actually probably do a timestamp of when I shut up and just read. But I'll do another preamble tomorrow probably. And the last I think the last picture I want to use, if I do use one, is the one used in Battle for Middle-earth 2. You can probably Google it, but like Galadriel tearing down the walls of Tol Guldur in as described in the Appendix B of The Lord of the Rings. That they actually paint that and show that at the end of the game, and it is probably one of the most amazing visuals in Middle-earth ever. So I don't know. I care about a lot about this character especially, but Middle-earth as a whole. A lot of the world is shaped around her. Okay, enough preamble, for goodness sake. All right. Amroth and Nimrodel. Now remember, Christopher Tolkien is the one who wrote this and describes his father's writings on the subject of each part of the unfinished tale. So, so that changes voices from around then. Anyway, so it's easy to tell who's talking. I've said earlier that if Amroth were indeed thought of as the son of Galadriel and Celeborn when The Lord of the Rings was written, so important a connection could hardly have escaped mention. But whether he was or not, this view of his parentage was later rejected. I give next a short tale dating from 1969 or later, entitled Part of the Legend of Amroth and Nimrodel, recounted in brief. Amroth was king of Lorien after his father Amdir was slain in the Battle of Dagorlad in the year 3434 of the Second Age. His land had peace for many years after the defeat of Sauron. Though Sindarin in descent, he lived after the manner of the Silvan Elves and housed in the tall trees of the great green mound, ever after called Seren Amroth. This he did because of his love for Nimrodel. For long years he had loved her, and taken no wife, since she would not wed with him. She loved him indeed, for he was beautiful even for one of the Eldar, and valiant and wise. But she was of the Silvan Elves, and regretted the incoming of the elves from the west, who, as she said, brought wars and destroyed the peace of old. She would speak only the Silvan tongue, even after it had fallen into disuse among the folk of Lorien. Right. A little postscript here. On the Silvan Elves and their speech, see Appendix A. Oh yeah, there's an appendix at the end of this. I'll get to that too. And she dwelt alone beside the falls of the river Nimrodel, to which she gave her name. But when the terror came out of Moria, and the dwarves were driven out, and in their stead orcs crept in, she fled distraught alone south into empty lands, in the year 1981 of the Third Age. Amroth followed her, and at last he found her under the eaves of Fangorn, which in those days drew much nearer to Lorien. Another postscript. See Appendix C on the boundaries of Lorien. I'll get to those two. She dared not enter the wood, for the trees, she said, menaced her, and some moved to bar her way. There Amroth and Nimrodel held a long debate, and at the last they plighted their troth. To this I will be true, she said, and we shall be wedded when you bring me to a land of peace. Amroth vowed that for her sake he would leave his people, even in their time of need, and with her seek for such a land. But there is none now in Middle-earth, he said, and will not be for the elven folk ever again. We must seek for a passage over the great sea to the ancient west. Then he told her of the haven to the south, where many of his own people had come long ago. They are now diminished, for most have set sail into the west. But the remnant of them still build ships and offer passage to any of their kin to come to them, weary of Middle-earth. It is said that the grace of the Valar gave to us to pass over the sea is granted also now to any of those who made the great journey, even if they did not come in the ages past to the shores and have not yet beheld the blessed land. There is not here the place to tell of their journey into the land of Gondor. It was in the days of the King Eärnil II, the last but one of the kings of the southern realm, and his lands were troubled. Eärnil II reigned in Gondor from 1945 to 2043. Elsewhere it was told, but not in any extant writing, how they became separated, and how Amroth, after seeking her in vain, went to the Elfhaven and found that only a few still lingered there. Less than a shipload, and they had only one seaworthy ship. In this they were now preparing to depart, and to leave Middle-earth. They welcomed Amroth, being glad to strengthen their small company. But they were unwilling to await Nimrodel, whose coming seemed to them now beyond hope. If she came through the settled lands of Gondor, they said, she would not be molested, and might receive help, for the men of Gondor are good, and they are ruled by the descendants of the elf friends of old, who can still speak our tongue, after a fashion. But in the mountains are many unfriendly men and evil things. The year was waning to autumn, and before long great winds were to be expected, hostile and dangerous, even to elven ships, while they were still near to Middle-earth. But so great was the grief of Amroth that nonetheless they stayed their going for many weeks, and they lived on the ship, for their houses on the shore were stripped and empty. Then in the autumn there came a great night of storm, one of the fiercest in the annals of Gondor. It came from the cold northern waste, and roared down through Eriador into the lands of Gondor. One sec. Doing great havoc. The White Mountains were no shield against it, and many of the ships of men were swept out into the Bay of Belfalas and lost. The light elven ship was torn from its mooring and driven into the wild waters towards the coasts of Umbar. No tidings of it were ever heard in Middle-earth, but the elven ships made for this journey did not founder, and doubtless it left the circles of the world, and came at last to Eresia. But it did not bring Amroth thither. The storm fell upon the coasts of Gondor just as dawn was peering through the flying clouds. But when Amroth woke, the ship was already far from land. Crying aloud in despair, "Nimrodel!" he leapt into the sea and swam towards the fading shore. The mariners, with their elvish sight, for a long time could see him battling with the waves, until the rising sun gleamed through the clouds, and far off lit his bright hair like a spark of gold. No eyes of elves or men ever saw him again in Middle-earth. Of what befell Nimrodel nothing is said here, though there were many legends concerning her fate. The foregoing narrative was actually composed as an offshoot from an etymological discussion of the names of certain rivers in Middle-earth. In this case, the Gilrain, a river of Lebanon in Gondor that flowed into the Bay of Belfalas west of Ethir Anduin. And another facet of the legend of Nimrodel emerges from the discussion of the element rain. This was probably derived from the stem ran, wander, stray, go on uncertain course, as in Mithrandir, in the name Rana of the moon. This would not seem suitable to any of the rivers of Gondor, but the names of rivers may often apply only to part of their course, to their source, or to the lower reaches, or to other features that struck explorers who named them. In this case, however, the fragments of the legend of Amroth and Nimrodel offer an explanation. The Gilrain came swiftly down from the mountains, as did the other rivers of that region. But as it reached the end of the outlier of Ered Nimrais that separated it from Selos, see the map accompanying Volume 3 of The Lord of the Rings, it ran into a wide, shallow depression. In this it wandered for a while and formed a small mare at the southern end before it cut through a ridge and went on swiftly again to join the Cernai. When Nimrodel fled from Lorien, it is said that seeking for the sea she became lost in the White Mountains, until at last, by what road or path it is not told, she came to a river that reminded her of her own stream in Lorien. Her heart was lightened, and she sat by a mare, seeing the stars reflected in its dim waters, and listened to the waterfalls by which the river went again on its journey down to the sea. There she fell into a deep sleep of weariness, and so long she slept that she did not come down into Belfalas until Amroth's ship had been blown out to sea, and he was lost trying to swim back to Belfalas. This legend was well known in the Doran Ernil, the land of the prince, and no doubt the name was given in memory of it. It has a postscript for Land of the Prince, but I think I know what it's going to say. Because if you look at the map of Gondor, Dol Amroth is the elf haven along the south, like along the coast. And if you different from the movie, in the book, the Prince of Dol Amroth was like reinforcements for Gondor before the Rohirrim came. But since the Rohirrim were kind of the punctuation of the battle, the turning of the tide, adding an extra army of factions that no one's seen before, just to go into more elf lore, would have slowed down the movie, and I get that. So but though the reinforcements of Gondor are men from this settlement, which is named after Amroth. Anyway, postscript says, the origin of the name Doran Ernil is nowhere given. Its only other occurrence is on the large map of Rohan, Gondor, and Mordor in The Lord of the Rings. On that map, it is placed on the other side of the mountain from Dol Amroth, but its occurrence in the present context suggests that Ernil was the prince of Dol Amroth, which might be supposed in any case. The essay continues with a brief explanation of how Amroth, as king of Lorien, related to the rule there of Celeborn and Galadriel. The people of Lorien were, even then, i.e. at the time of the loss of Amroth, much as they were at the end of the Third Age, Silvan Elves in origin, but ruled by princes of Sindarin descent, as was the realm of Thranduil in the northern parts of Mirkwood, though whether Thranduil and Amroth were akin is not now known. Oh, another postscript. Yeah. See Appendix B on the Sindarin princes and the Silvan Elves. I'll get to that later. I'm just going to hold my finger here to hold the page. It's only a couple pages away anyway. They had, however, been much mingled with Noldor, of Sindarin speech, who passed through Moria after the destruction of Eregion by Sauron in the year 1697 of the Second Age. At that time, Elrond went westward, probably meaning simply that he did not cross the Misty Mountains, and established the refuge of Imladris. But Celeborn went at first to Lorien and fortified it against any further attempts of Sauron to cross the Anduin. When, however, Sauron withdrew to Mordor and was, as reported, wholly concerned with conquests in the east, Celeborn rejoined Galadriel in Lindon. Lindon is like where the Grey Havens are, basically. That's like the kingdom of Grey Havens. Yeah. At this time, Gil-galad would be its ruler, and then he passes it to Círdan, I think. The shipwright. Lorien had then long years of peace and obscurity under the rule of its own king Amdir, until the downfall of Númenor and the sudden return of Sauron to Middle-earth. Amdir obeyed the summons of Gil-galad and brought as large a force as he could muster to the last alliance. But he was slain in the Battle of Dagorlad, and most of his company with him. Amroth, his son, became king. This account is, of course, greatly at variance with that contained in concerning Galadriel and Celeborn. Amroth is no longer the son of Galadriel and Celeborn, but of Amdir, a prince of Sindarin origin. The older story of the relations of Galadriel and Celeborn with Eregion and Lorien seems to have been modified in many important respects, but how much of it would have been retained in any fully written narrative cannot be said. Celeborn's association with Lorien is now placed much further back, for in concerning Galadriel and Celeborn, he never went to Lorien at all during the Second Age. And we learn here that many Noldoran elves passed through Moria to Lorien after the destruction of Eregion. In the earlier account, there is no suggestion of this, and the movement of Beleriandic elves into Lorien took under peaceful conditions many years before. The implication of the extract just given is that after Eregion's fall, Celeborn led this migration to Lorien, while Galadriel joined Gil-galad in Lindon. But elsewhere, in a writing contemporary with this, it is said explicitly that they both at that time passed through Moria with a considerable following of Noldoran exiles and dwelt for many years in Lorien. It is neither asserted nor denied that these late writings of Galadriel or Celeborn had relations with Lorien before 1697, and there are no other references outside concerning Galadriel and Celeborn to Celebrimbor's revolt at some time between 1350 and 1400 against their rule in Eregion, nor to Galadriel's departure at that time to Lorien and her taking up rule there, while Celeborn remained behind in Eregion. It is not made clear in the late accounts where Galadriel and Celeborn passed the long years of the Second Age after the defeat of Sauron in Eriador. There are, at any rate, no further mentions of their age-long sojourn in Belfalas. Whoa, that's one fact there. So, like, that entire paragraph is exploring the contradictions, to say the least. I also don't think that, like, considering how many hundreds of years are passing, I don't think any of these necessarily are mutually exclusive, except for the fact that Amroth was never in Lorien. I think that's the and of course that he was not Galadriel and Celeborn's son. So, but who the hell was Amdir? I have to look that up too. I'm curious. I'm rediscovering this along with you. Yeah. So, yeah, like Galadriel could have gone to Linden. They could have passed through Moria at the same time, especially since Galadriel and Celeborn, I think, are more responsible for the alliance with the dwarves than Celeborn. I think they said Celeborn was distrustful of the dwarves, so I don't think he'd have it in him to literally pass all the way from the west gate to the east gate, without a buffer, be it Celebrimbor or Galadriel. So, but Celebrimbor is dead at this point when Austin Ethel kind of fell, and his smiths were kind of betrayed and shit. So, I'm pretty sure Galadriel would have gone with him to Lorien, and she's like, okay, you deal with the people here, I'm going to Linden. I'm gonna hang out with Gil-galad for a while, see what's up there. So, yeah, so it does leave the story of Amroth kind of separate, but the story's not done, of course, so I'll continue. The discussion of Amroth continues. But during the Third Age, Galadriel became filled with foreboding, and with Celeborn she journeyed to Lorien and stayed there long with Amroth, being especially concerned to learn all news and rumors of the growing shadow in Mirkwood, and the dark stronghold of Dol Guldur. But his people were content with Amroth. He was valiant and wise, and his little kingdom was yet prosperous and beautiful. Therefore, after long journeys of inquiry in Rhovanion, from Gondor and the borders of Mordor to Thranduil in the north, Celeborn and Galadriel passed over the mountains to Imladris, and there dwelt for many years. For Elrond was their kinsman, since he had early in the Third Age, in the year 109, according to the Tale of Years, wedded their daughter, Celebrian. After the disaster in Moria in the year 1980, and the sorrows of Lorien, which was now left without a ruler, for Amroth was drowned in the sea in the Bay of Belfalas and left no heir, Celeborn and Galadriel returned to Lorien, and were welcomed by the people. There they dwelt while the Third Age lasted, but they took no title of king or queen, for they said that they were only guardians of this small but fair realm, the last eastward outpost of the elves. Elsewhere, there is one other reference to their movements during those years. To Lorien, Celeborn and Galadriel returned twice before the last alliance, and the end of the Second Age. And in the Third Age, when the shadow of Sauron's recovery arose, they dwelt there again for a long time. In her wisdom, Galadriel saw that Lorien would be a stronghold and point of power to prevent the shadow from crossing the Anduin in the war that must inevitably come before it was again defeated, if that were possible. But that it needed a rule of greater strength and wisdom than the Sylvan folk possessed. Nevertheless, it was not until the disaster in Moria, when by means beyond the foresight of Galadriel and Sauron's power actually crossed the Anduin, and Lorien was in great peril. Its king lost, its people fleeing and likely to leave it deserted to be occupied by orcs, that Galadriel and Celeborn took up their permanent abode in Lorien and its government. But they took no title of king or queen, and were the guardians that, in the event, brought it unviolated through the War of the Ring. Yeah, so yeah, they were never rulers, I guess, of Lorien. Okay, I'm piecing this together here. Okay, I'm gonna, see if I can translate this, essentially. This is what happens when you put multiple drafts into the story. Like, it's clear what Tolkien had in mind, but he wanted to expand on it, So, Amdir was the Sylvan king. The Sylvans are elves who didn't ever go to Valinor, never went to the Blessed Land, Undying Lands. And meanwhile, the Noldor are exiles who speak Sindarin. So Sindarin and Noldor are probably a bit interchangeable in this context. The language is Sindarin, the race is Noldor. The Sylvan are like Thranduil and Legolas, the Mirkwood elves, who are, not blessed with the wisdom bestowed by the Valar because they didn't finish their journey, which is kind of an egotistical stance, but that is certainly some subject matter. Like, there is truth to it. Those who saw Valinor are inherently more aware of everything. It's like the difference between, hunters who survive by their own wit and people who have had access to the internet, right? You have a better bird's eye view if you've been on the internet. Valinor is the internet. Let it be stated right here, right now. The Undying Lands is 4chan. No, it's not. But like Wikipedia and all that stuff, except like being taught personally under the only writers who were, by the way, the creators of that knowledge. Not just the people who made the post on Wikipedia, but they are the reason that physical thing in nature exists. So like a degree of separation from creation itself. Compared to, cool, he can shoot 3 arrows at once. Like, no, I'm pretty sure that the Mirkwood elves or Greenwood elves are exceptional, superior marksmen, as depicted with Legolas, even though it still only counts as one. But that's why the Sylvans never got a ring of power. Only the Noldor got the 3 rings. Even though Thranduil is a king of elves, he was not a Noldor elf. So that's why only Elrond, Galadriel, and Gil-galad, who passed it to Círdan, got the rings. So there is a bit of elitism between, Eriador, Lorien, and Rovanion. Lindon in Ladris, and Lorien as opposed to Rovanion or Mirkwood. I just want to share that disparity because there is a separation between them. So that might also add some subtext for, next time you're watching the Lord of the Rings trilogy, that with Legolas representing elfdom, he's representing a lower caste of them. He's still the prince, but he's the prince of the least knowledgeable elves in terms of lore and knowledge and stuff, at least in terms of information, as opposed to the knowledge of the forest. I think by far Sylvans, Grey Elves, Wood Elves have that advantage. I think there's a David Day book which is good at depicting like the different branches of the elves. Okay. I should keep reading. I think did I make my point? Oh crap, I got iced tea on my book. No. So, yeah, Amroth fell in love, waited in Gondor. Nimrodel got stoned. High off the reflections in the water in the White Mountains. So Amroth died, leaving Lorien without an heir, which is why Galadriel and Celeborn are living in Lorien. I don't think they founded it. They kind of took it up It was an elven, or it was a Silvan kingdom, that side of the Misty Mountains, that side of Moria. Eregion was where the craftsmanship happened, and that was on the western side of the mountain. Anyway, in another etymological discussion of the same period, the name Amroth is explained as being a nickname derived from his living in a high talon or flet, the wooden platforms built high up in the trees of Lothlorien, in which the Galadriel dwelt. As in the Fellowship of the Ring. You'd see that in the extended version when Aragorn's pleading with Haldir. They're up in those talons. It meant up climber, high climber. Oh, another postscript. Thought I saved my page. Okay. The explanation supposes that the first element of the name Amroth is the same Elvish word in Quenya, Amba, up, found also in Sindarin Ammon, a hill or mountain with steep sides, while the second element is a derivative from a stem rath, meaning climb, whence also the noun rath, which in the Numenorean Sindarin used in Gondor in the naming of places and persons was applied to all the longer roadways and streets in Minas Tirith, nearly all of which were on an incline. So Rath Dinan, the silent street leading down from the citadel to the Tomb of Kings. Yeah, fun fact, Gondorians were Elven fanboys. Particularly in the Second Age, and then they're kind of like, we're better in the Third. Anyways, I digress. I love this stuff so much. It is said here that the custom of dwelling in trees was not a habit of the Silvan Elves in general, but it was developed in Lorien by the nature and situation of the land. A flat land with no good stone, except what might be quarried in the mountains westward and brought with difficulty down the Silverlode. Its chief wealth was in its trees, the remnant of the great forests of the elder days. But the dwelling in trees was not universal, even in Lorien, and the Talain or flets were in origin either refuges to be used in the event of attack, or most often, especially those high up in the great trees, outlook posts from which the land and its borders could be surveyed by elvish eyes. For Lorien, after the end of the first millennium of the Third Age, became a land of uneasy vigilance, and Amroth must have dwelt in growing disquiet ever since Dol Guldur was established in Mirkwood. Okay. Such an outlook post used by the Wardens of the North Marches was the Flet, in which Frodo spent the night. The abode of Celeborn and Caras Galadon was also of the same origin. Its highest Flet, which the Fellowship of the Ring did not see, was the highest point in the land. Earlier, the Flet of Amroth, at the top of the great mound or hill of Seren Amroth, piled by the labor of many hands, had been at the highest and was principally designed to watch Dol Guldur across the Anduin. The conversion of these Talain into permanent dwellings was a later development, and only in Caras Galadon were such dwellings numerous. But Caras Galadon was itself a fortress, and only a small part of the Galadrim dwelt within its walls. Living in such lofty houses was no doubt at first thought remarkable, and Amroth was probably the first to do so. It was thus from his living in a high talan that his name, the only one that was later remembered in legend, was most probably derived. A note to the words, Amroth was probably the first to do so, states, unless it was Nimrodel. Her motives were different. She loved the waters and the falls of Nimrodel, from which she would not long be parted. But as times darkened, the stream was too near the north borders, and in a part where few of the Galadrim now dwelt. Maybe it was from her that Amroth took the idea of living in a high flet. Another postscript. In the brief recounting of the legend of Amroth and Nimrodel, it is said that Amroth dwelt in the trees of Serin Amroth because of his love for Nimrodel. Returning to the legend of Amroth and Nimrodel given above, which was the haven in the south where Amroth waited for Nimrodel, and where, as he told her, many of his own people had come long ago. Two passages in The Lord of the Rings bear on this question. One in the Fellowship of the Ring, in Chapter 6 of Part 2, where Legolas, after singing the song of Amroth and Nimrodel, speaks of the Bay of Belfalas, whence the elves of Lorien set sail. The other is in The Return of the King, Book 5, which is Book 5, Chapter 9, where Legolas, looking on Prince Imrahil of Dol Amroth, saw that he was one who had elfin blood in his veins, and said to him, "It is long since the people of Nimrodel left the woodlands of Lorien, and yet still one may see that not all sailed from Amroth's haven west over water." To which Prince Imrahil replied, "So it is said in the lore of my day, or so it is said in the lore of my land." Interesting. Late and fragmentary notes go some way to explaining these references. Thus, in a discussion of linguistic and political interrelations in Middle-earth, dating from 1969 or later, there is a passing reference to the fact that in the days of the earlier settlements of Numenor, the shores of the Bay of Belfalas were still mainly desolate, except for a haven and small settlement of elves at the south of the confluence of Morthond and Ringlo, as in just north of Dol Amroth. This, according to the traditions of Dol Amroth, had been established by seafaring Sindar from the west havens of Bereliand, who fled in 3 small ships when the power of Morgoth overwhelmed the Eldar and the Atari. But it was later increased by adventurers of the Silvan Elves seeking for the sea who came down Anduin. The Silvan Elves, it is remarked here, were never wholly free of an unquiet and a yearning for the sea, which at times drove some of them to wander from their homes. To relate the story of the 3 small ships to the traditions recorded in the Silmarillion, we would probably have to assume that they escaped from Brithombar and Eglarest, the havens of the Falas, on the west coast of Beleriand, when they were destroyed in the year after the Nerneath Arnoediad in the Silmarillion on page 196. But that whereas Círdan and Gil-galad made a refuge on the Isle of Balar, these 3 ships' companions sailed far further south down the coast to Belfalas. But a quite different account making the establishment of the Elvish haven later is given to an unfinished scrap on the origin of the name Belfalas. It is said here that while the element Bel is certainly derived from the pre-Numenorian name, its source was in fact Sindarin. The note peters out before any further information is given about Bel, but the reason given for its Sindarin origin is that there was one small but important element in Gondor of quite exceptional kind, an Eldarin settlement. After the breaking of Dagorlad, the elves of Beleriand, if they did not take ship over the Great Sea or remain in Lindon, wandered east over the Blue Mountains into Eriador. But there appears nonetheless to have been a group of Sindar who, at the beginning of the Second Age, went south. They were a remnant of the people of Doriath, who harbored still their grudge against the Noldor, and having remained a while at the Grey Havens, where they learned the craft of shipbuilding, they went in the course of years seeking a place to live for lives of their own, and at last they settled at the mouth of Morthond. There was already a primitive harbor there of fisher folk, but these in fear of the Eldar fled into the mountains. Next postscript says, the place of the Elvish haven in Belfalas is marked with the name Ethelond, or Elfhaven. See the appendix of the Silmarillion under Ethel and Londe. On the decorated map of Middle-earth by Pauline Baines, but I have found no other occurrence of this name. See Appendix D, The Adventures of Tom Bombadil. In the Landstrad and Dol Amroth there were many traditions of the ancient Elvish dwellings, and of the haven at the mouth of the Morthond, from which westward ships had sailed as far back as the fall of Eregion in the Second Age. I actually have not read The Adventures of Tom Bombadil. I could do that too, if this is engaging enough. I mean, I'd probably do anyway because this is fun. In the note written in December 1972 or later, and among the last writings of my fathers on the subject of Middle-earth, there is a discussion of the elvish strain in men, as to its being observable in the beardlessness of those who were descended. It was a characteristic of all elves to be beardless, and it is here noted in connection with the princely house of Dol Amroth that this line had a special elvish strain according to its own legends, with a reference to the speeches between Legolas and Imrahil in Lord of the Rings, Return of the King, Book 5, Chapter 9, cited above. As Legolas's mention of Nimrodel shows, there was an ancient elvish port near Dol Amroth, and a small settlement of Silvan Elves there from Lorien. The legend of the prince's line was that one of their earliest fathers had wedded an elf maiden. In some versions, it was indeed evidently improbably, said to have been Nimrodel herself. In other tales, and more probably, it was one of Nimrodel's companions who was lost in the upper mountain glens. This latter version of the legend appears in more detailed form in a note appended to an unpublished genealogy of the line of Dol Amroth from Angalamar, the 20th prince, father of Adrahil, father of Imrahil, prince of Dol Amroth at the time of the War of the Ring. In the tradition of his house, Angalamar was the 20th in unbroken descent from Galador, first Lord of Dol Amroth, in the Third Age, 2004 to 2129. According to the same traditions, Galador was the son of Imrazor the Númenorian, who dwelt in Belfalas, and the elven lady Mithralis. She was one of the companions of Nimrodel among many of the elves that fled to the coast about the year 1980 in the Third Age, when evil arose in Moria, and Nimrodel and her maidens strayed in the wooded hills, and were lost. But in this tale it is said that Imrazor harbored Mithralis and took her to wife. When she had borne him a son, Galador, and a daughter, Gilmith. Galador and Gilmith. Okay. She slipped away by night and he saw her no more. But through Mithralis was the lesser Sylvan race, and not of the High Elves or the Grey. It was ever held that the house and kin of the lords of Dol Amroth was noble by blood, as they were fair in face and mind. All right. Next part's the Elessar, which is about Aragorn. I should probably get into it too, just because I want to go over. A lot of that was about Amroth and not Galadriel and Celeborn, but I think Amroth was still relevant in terms of, the history of Lorien and why they dwelt in Lorien, as opposed to the descendants of Amroth. And so Nimrodel didn't remained in the White Mountains. Amroth died waiting for her on the ship during a bad storm, the worst storm in Gondorian history. And the descendants of one of her maids, or handmaids, were the first princes of Dol Amroth. But she left, and yeah, that's why the Dol Amrothi princes are half elven, just like in Rivendell. You could argue that Rivendell and Dol Amroth are not the same. Because Dol Amrothi would basically be because they're half elven, they have to choose between, like, they have to basically appeal to the gods which gene is dominant, my elven or my human. In a very fantasy way, you verbally have to choose. And with Elrond, his brother chose human, and his descendants were the Dunedain, and Elrond chose elvendom. So he's Elrond half-elven, but he's been alive for thousands and thousands and thousands of years. So, yeah, that's what that's up with. And I think the Dol Amrothi chose to be humans, but that doesn't mean they don't live for a long-ass time. This guy's rule was from the Third Age, 2004 to 2129. Let's compare, when the Return of the King comes out in theaters, and then that's when your reign begins, and then your reign ends still over 100 years from now. Yeah, so lives are long in Middle-earth, at least during this time period. And, I mean, the Dunedain have long lives as well. But this is before so much fading had happened. There is still fading, but it's not as pronounced. It's still like a middle phase of the fading and the separation of the world of elves and men into, like, Ea and Arda. You know what I mean? Like, Middle-earth and Valinor. Totally being separated at the end of the Third Age. And the Fourth Age, the Age of Men. So, anyway, Elessar. In unpublished writing, there is little else to be found concerning the history of Celeborn and Galadriel, save for a very rough manuscript of 4 pages titled The Elessar. It is in the first stage of composition, but bears a few penciled emendations. There are no other versions. It reads, with some very slight editorial emendations, as follows. There was in Gondolin a jewelsmith named Enerthil. And it's okay. Here's a pronunciation thing for Middle-earth. Enerdil. It looks like Enerdil. Enerdhil, but the dh is pronounced like the, like the. So Enerthil. The greatest of that among the Noldor after the death of Fëanor. Enerthil loved all green things that grew, and his greatest joy was to see the sunlight through the leaves of trees. And it came into his heart to make a jewel within which the clear light of the sun should be imprisoned, but the jewel should be green as leaves. And he made this thing, and even the Noldor marveled at it. For it is said that those who looked through the stone saw things that were withered or burned, healed. Okay, through the stone saw things that were withered or burned, healed again, or as they were in the grace of their youth, and that the hands of one who held it brought to all that they touched healing from hurt. So like he made like a healing stone. This gem Eärendil gave to Idril, the king's daughter, and she wore it upon her breast, and so it was saved from the burning of Gondolin. And before Idril set sail she said to Eärendil, her son, "The Elessar I leave with thee, for there are grievous hurts in Middle-earth, which thou maybe shalt heal, but to none other shalt thou deliver it. And indeed, at Sirion's haven there were many hurts to heal, both of men and elves, and of beasts that fled thither from the horror of the north. And while Eärendil dwelt there, they were healed and prospered, and all things were for a while green and fair. But when Eärendil began his great voyages upon the sea, he wore the Elessar upon his breast. For amongst all his searchings, the thought was always before him, that he might perhaps find Idril again. And his first memory of Middle-earth was the green stone above her breast, as she sang above his cradle while Gondolin was still in flower. So it was that the Elessar passed away, when Eärendil returned no more to Middle-earth. Yeah, Eärendil's voyage was famously him returning one of the Silmarils, the only surviving Silmaril, back to Valinor. Yeah, so he was, that was his big landmark in the lore. But more than that, he was Elrond's father. I guess more relevantly, but not in terms of, chronological. Like, that's a big deal. Got the Silmarils the heck out of Middle-earth. That's all that Noldor wanted, to return the Silmaril from Middle-earth, because Morgoth took it. And he was like, okay, well, 2 of them are gone, but the 3rd one's safe. Here you go. In ages after, there was again an Elessar, and of this 2 things are said, though which is true only those wise, capital W, so, could say who now are gone. For some say that the second was indeed only the first returned, by the grace of the Valar, and that Olorin, who was known in Middle-earth as Mithrandir, or Gandalf, brought it with him out of the west. And on a time Olorin came to Galadriel, who dwelt now under the trees of Greenwood the Great, and they had long speech together, for the years of her exile began to lie heavy on the Lady of the Noldor, and she longed for news of her kin and for the blessed land of her birth, and yet was unwilling to forsake Middle-earth. The sentence was changed to read, but was not permitted yet to forsake Middle-earth. And when Olorin had told her many tidings, she sighed and said, I grieve in Middle-earth, for leaves fall and flowers fade, and my heart yearns, remembering trees and grass that do not die. I would have these in my home. Then Olorin said, would you then have the Elessar? And Galadriel said, where now is the stone of Eärendil, and Eärendil is gone who made it? Who knows? Said Olorin. Surely, said Galadriel, they have passed over a sea, as almost all fair things beside. And must Middle-earth then fade and perish forever? That is its fate, said Olorin. Yet for a little while that might be amended, if the Elessar should return. For a little, until the days of men are come. If and yet, how could that be, said Galadriel? For surely the Valar are now removed, and Middle-earth is far from their thoughts, and all who cling to it are under a shadow. It is not so, said Olorin. Their eyes are not dimmed, nor their hearts hardened. In token of which, look upon this. He held before her the Elessar, and she took it on it and wondered. And Olorin said, this I bring to you from Yavanna. Use it as you may, and for a while you shall make the land of your dwelling the fairest place in Middle-earth. But it is not for you to possess. You shall hand it on when the time comes. For before you grow weary and at last forsake Middle-earth, one shall come who is to receive it, and his name shall be that of the stone. Elessar he shall be called. Now, some of your memories are tingling to that. Wrong word. This chimes with the passage in Fellowship of the Ring. Did they say Fellowship? Good lord, this isn't even the first printing. The Fellowship of the Ring. That's an E, not an O. God damn. The chimes with the passage The Fellowship of the Ring, Part 2, Chapter 8, where Galadriel, giving the green stone to Aragorn, said, "In this hour take the name that was foretold for you, Elessar, the elf stone of the house of Elendil." Fellowship. Unforgivable. Come on, Tolkien estate. The other tale runs so. Long ago, ere Sauron had deluded the smiths of Eregion, Galadriel came there, and she said to Celebrimbor, the chief of elven smiths, "I am grieved in Middle-earth, for leaves fall, and flowers fade that I have loved, so that the land of my dwelling is filled with regret that no spring can redress. How otherwise can it be for the Eldar if they cling to Middle-earth?" said Celebrimbor. "Will you then pass over sea?" "Nay," she said. "Amroth is gone, and Angnor is gone, and Felagund is no more. Of Finarfin's children I am the last." Post note is the text here and again immediately below has Finrod, which I have changed to Finarfin to avoid confusion. Before the revised edition of The Lord of the Rings was published in 1966, my father changed Finrod to Finarfin, while his son Felagund, previously named Inglor Felagund, became Finrod Felagund. Two passages in the Appendix B and F were accordingly amended for the revised edition. It is noteworthy that Orodrith, king of Nargothrond after Finrod Felagund, is not here named by Galadriel among her brothers. For a reason unknown to me, my father displaced the second king of Nargothrond and made him a member of the same family in the next generation. But this and associated genealogical changes were never incorporated in the narratives of the Silmarillion. Okay, but my heart is still proud. What wrong did the golden house of Finarfin do that I should ask the pardon of the Valar, or be content with an isle in the sea whose native land was Aman the Blessed? Here I am mightier. What would you then? What would you then? Said Celebrimbor. I would have trees and grass about me that do not die, here in the land that is mine, she answered. What has become of the skill of the Eldar? And Celebrimbor said, Where now is the stone of Erendil? And Enardil, who made it, is gone. They have passed over the sea, said Galadriel, with almost all fair things else. But must then Middle-earth fade and perish forever? That is its fate, I deem, said Celebrimbor. But you know that I love you, though you turned to Celeborn of the trees, and for that love I will do what I can, if, haply, by my art your grief can be lessened. Ooh, so Celebrimbor had the feels for her, damn. Plot twist. But he did not say to Galadriel that he himself was of Gondolin long ago, and a friend of Enardil, though his friend is in most things outrivaled him. Yet if Enardil had not been there, Yet if Enardil had not been then Celebrimbor would have been more renowned. Therefore he took thought and began a long and delicate labor, and so for Galadriel he made the greatest of his works, save the three rings only. And it is said that more subtle and clear was the green gem that he made than that of Enerthil, but yet its light was had less power. For whereas that of Enerthil was lit by the sun in its youth, already many years had passed ere Celebrimbor began his work, and nowhere in Middle-earth was the light as clear as it had been. For though Morgoth had been thrust out into the void, and could not enter again, his far shadow lay upon it. Radiant none the less was the Elessar of Celebrimbor, and he set it within a great brooch of silver, in the likeness of an eagle rising upward, rising upon outspread wings. Postscript says, compare the description of the Elfstone in the Fellowship of the Ring, in Book 2, Chapter 8. Then Galadriel lifted from her lap a great stone of a clear green, set in a silver brooch that was wrought in the likeness of an eagle with outspread wings. And as she held it up, the gem flashed like the sun, shining through the leaves of spring. At the end is written... Oh, sorry, there's more. Wielding the Elessar, all things grew fair about Galadriel, until the coming of the shadow to the forest. But afterwards, when Nenya, chief of the three, was sent to her by Celebrimbor, she needed it, as she thought, no more, and she gave it to Celebrian her daughter. And so it came to Arwen and to Aragorn, who was called Elessar. Okay, postscript, chief of the three. But in the Return of the King, Book 6, Chapter 9, where the blue ring is seen on Elrond's finger, it is called Vilya, mightiest of the three. So, me trying to, the thing is, people get caught up in saying, like, well, this says one thing, but this says another. So therefore it contradicts, therefore nothing is real. My thought is that Nenya was created and was the mightiest during this time period, but Vilya, Elrond's ring, would have been mightier by the end of the Third Age. Who knows? Well, I mean, this is, showing it. So, yeah. So I think Nenya remained the strongest during the Second Age, and Vilya for the Third Age. Maybe because he's half-elven. The human side of him is the domain of men. And that's why it was the mightiest at the time. During that chapters during the, post-victory, when Elrond comes to, Minas Tirith and whatnot, or not Minas Tirith, during the epilogue, right, when everyone's, homecoming. It could be, emblematic of the fact that the age of humans is now begun and the age of elves is over. That would be why it is currently mightiest, and the rings are passing anyway. It's also the last postscript for this, so sorry this is taking so long. I digress so much. But I like talking about this. I love Middle-earth. Middle-earth is so freaking great. At the end it is written, the Elessar was made in Gondolin by Celebrimbor, and so came to Idril, and so to Erendil. But that passed away. The second Elessar was made also by Celebrimbor in Eregion, at the request of the Lady Galadriel, whom he loved. And it was not under the one being made before Sauron rose again. Yeah, so it wasn't from Sauron's lore that it was created, because that would have corrupted it. This narrative goes with concerning Galadriel and Celeborn in certain features, and was probably written at about the same time, or a little earlier. Celebrimbor is here again a jewelsmith of Gondolin, rather than one of the Fëanorians, and Galadriel is spoken of as being unwilling to forsake Middle-earth, though the text was later amended and the conception of the ban introduced. And at a later point in the narrative, she speaks of the pardon of the Valar. So yeah, later iterations, like she's like less honorable about like, I cannot forsake Middle-earth. Oh, it's like, I'm stuck on Middle-earth, so I want to make the most of this. This sucks. Enervale appears in no other writing, and the concluding words of the text show that Celebrimbor was to displace him as the maker of the Elessar in Gondolin. Of Celebrimbor's love for Galadriel there is no trace elsewhere. In concerning Galadriel and Celeborn, the suggestion is that he came to Eregion with them. But in that text, as in the Silmarillion, Galadriel met Celeborn in Doriath, and it is difficult to understand Celebrimbor's words, though you turn to Celeborn of the trees. Obscure also is the reference to Galadriel's dwelling under the trees of Greenwood the Great. This might be taken as a loose use, nowhere else evidenced, of the expression to include the woods of Lorien on the other side of the Anduin. But the coming of the shadow of the forest undoubtedly refers to the rise of Sauron in Dol Guldur, which the Appendix A in the Lord of the Rings is called the Shadow of the Forest. This may imply that Galadriel's power at one time extended into the southern parts of Greenwood the Great, and support for this may be found in concerning Galadriel and Celeborn, where the realm of Lorinand, or Lorien, is said to have extended into the forests on both sides of the Great River, including the region where afterwards was Dol Guldur. So that lends to it even more. With the coming of the shadow, that would weaken her ring anyway. So I don't think Tolkien made this by accident, or made that reference accidentally. It is possible also that the same conception underlay the statement in Appendix B in The Lord of the Rings, in the head note to the Tale of Years of the Second Age, as it appeared in the first edition. Many of the Sindar passed eastward and established realms in the forests far away. The chief of these were Thranduil in the north of Greenwood the Great, and Celeborn in the south of the forest. In the revised edition, this remark about Celeborn was omitted, and instead there appears a reference to his dwelling in Lindon, cited above. Lastly, it may be remarked that the healing power here ascribed to the Elessar at the havens of Sirion in the Silmarillion attributed to the Silmaril. Interesting. So yeah, within all of this, I don't care what story is told, as long as they don't butcher the key points and keep the spirit of it together. The relation with the dwarves is also going to be prevalent. I'm looking forward to see, I'm cautiously optimistic about what they do with the relation between the Durin's folk and the Smiths of Austin Ithil and the region at large. Anyway, so that's the end of the main script. So here's the appendices really quick. Then I'll just review some other stuff, and then I'll just wrap this up. This is going for a while, but I hope this is entertaining. Okay, appendices. Appendix A: the Silvan Elves and their speech. According to the Silmarillion, some of the Nandor, the Telerian elves who abandoned the march of the Eldar on the eastern side of the Misty Mountains, dwelt age-long in the woods of the Vale of the Great River, while others, it is said, went down Anduin to its mouth, and yet others entered Eriador. From these last came the Green Elves and of Osiriand. In the late etymological discussion of the names Galadriel, Celeborn, and Lorien, the Silvan Elves of Mirkwood and Lorien are specifically declared to be descended from the Telerian Elves who remained in the Vale of Anduin. The Silvan Elves the Tawarwaith, were in origin Teleri, and so remoter kin of the Sindar, though even longer separated from them than the Teleri of Valinor. They were descended from those of the Teleri who, on the great journey, were daunted by the misty mountains, and lingered in the Vale of Anduin, and so never reached Beleriand or the sea. They were thus closer akin to the Nandor, otherwise called the Green Elves, of Osiriand, who eventually crossed the mountains and came at last into Beleriand. The Silvan Elves hid themselves in woodland fastnesses beyond the misty mountains, and became small and scattered peoples, hardly to be distinguished from Avari. But they still remembered that they were in origin Eldar, members of the third clan, and they welcomed those of the Noldor, and especially the Sindar, who did not pass over the sea, but migrated eastward, i.e. at the beginning of the Second Age. Under the leadership of these, they became again ordered folk and increased in wisdom. Thranduil, father of Legolas, of the Nine Walkers. Nine Walkers is in the Fellowship, by the way. This isn't like an Elvish thing. Goes along with nine companions to match the 9 raids. So be it. You'll be the Fellowship of the Ring. That was a deleted scene in the movie, but that was how it was written in the thing. So Legolas of the 9 Walkers is like, Pippin was one of the 9 Walkers as well. You know what I mean? Anyways, with Thranduil, father of Legolas of the 9 Walkers, was Sindarin, and that tongue was used in his house, though not by all his folk. In Lorien, where many of the people were Sindarin in origin, or Noldor, survivors from Eregion, Sindarin had become the language of all the people. In what way their Sindarin differed from the forms of Beleriand, see Fellowship of the Ring, Book 2, Chapter 6, where Frodo reports that the speech of the Sylvan folk that they used among themselves were unlike that of the West, is not, of course, now known. It probably differed in little more than what would now be popularly called accent, mainly differences of vowel sounds or in an intonation sufficient to mislead one who, as Frodo, who was not well acquainted with pure Sindarin. There may, of course, also have been some local words and other features ultimately due to the influence of the former Sylvan tongue. Lorien had long been much isolated from the outside world. Certainly some names preserved from the past, such as Amroth and Imrardel, cannot be fully explained from Sindarin, though fitting it in form. Karas seemed to be an old word for a moated fortress, not found in Sindarin. Lorien is probably an alteration of an older name now lost, though earlier the original Sylvan or Nandoran name was stated to be Lorinand. With these remarks on Sylvan names, compare Appendix F in the Lord of the Rings section of the Elves footnote, appearing only in the revised edition. Another general statement concerning Silvan Elvish, is found in a linguistic historical discussion dating from the same late period as that just cited. Although the dialects of the Silvan Elves, when they again met their long-separated kindred, had so far diverged from Sindarin as to be hardly intelligible, little study was needed to reveal their kinship as Eldarin tongues. Though the comparison of the Sylvan dialects with their own speech greatly interested the lore masters, especially those of Noldoran origin, little is now known of the Silvan Elvish. The Silvan Elves had invented no forms of writing, and those who learned this art from the Sindar wrote in Sindarin as well as they could. By the end of the Third Age, the Sylvan tongues had properly ceased to be spoken in the 2 regions that had importance at the time of the War of the Ring, Lorien and the realm of Thranduil in northern Mirkwood. All that survived of them in the records was a few words and several names of persons and places. Alright, Appendix B, the Sindarin Princes and the Silvan Elves. In Appendix B of the Lord of the Rings, in the head note to the Tale of the years of the Second Age, it is said that before the building of the Barad-dûr, many of the Sindar passed eastward, and some established realms in the forests far away, where their people were mostly Silvan Elves. Thranduil, king of the north of Greenwood the Great, was one of these. Something more of the history of these Sindarin princes and the Silvan Elves is found in my father's late philosophical writings. Thus, in one essay, Thranduil's realm is said to have extended into the woods surrounding the lonely mountain and growing along the west shores of the long lake, before the coming of the dwarves exiled from Moria and the invasion of the dragon. The elvish folk of this realm had migrated from the south, being the kin of neighbors of the elves of Lorien. They had dwelt in Greenwood the Great, east of Anduin. In the Second Age, their king, Orofer, the father of Thranduil, father of Legolas, had withdrawn northward beyond the Gladden Fields. This he did to be free from the power and encroachments of the dwarves of Moria, which had grown to be the greatest of the mansions of the dwarves recorded in history, and also he resented the intrusions of Celeborn and Galadriel into Lorien. But as yet there was little to fear between the Greenwood and the mountains, and there was constant intercourse between the people and their kin across the river, until the War of the Last Alliance. Despite the desire of the Silvan Elves to meddle as little as might be in the affairs of the Noldor and Sindar, or of any other peoples, dwarves, men, or orcs, Orofer had the wisdom to foresee that peace would not return unless Sauron was overcome. He therefore assembled a great army of his now numerous people, and joining with the lesser army of Malgalad of Lorien, he led the host of the Silvan Elves to battle. The Silvan Elves were hardy and valiant, but ill-equipped with armor and weapons in comparison with the Eldar of the West. Also, they were independent and not disposed to place themselves under the supreme command of Gil-galad. Their losses were thus more grievous than they need have been, even in that terrible war. Malgalad and more than half of his following perished in the Battle of the Dagorlad, being cut off from the main host and driven into the dead marshes. Orofer was slain in the first assault upon Mordor, rushing forward at the head of his most doughty warriors before Gil-galad had given the signal for the advance. Thranduil, his son, survived, but when the war ended and Sauron was slain, as it seemed, he led back home barely a third of the army that had marched to war. Malgalad of Lorien occurs nowhere else, and it is not said here that to be the father of Amroth. On the other hand, Amdir, father of Amroth, is twice said to have been slain in this battle of Dagorlad, and it seems therefore that Malgalad can be simply equated with Amdir, but which name replaced the other I cannot say. Maybe... okay. This is the worst case of death of the author. I want to say that Malgalad was the father of Amdir, who was the father of Amroth. Who's to say that father and son didn't both die in the Battle of Dagorlad? And then Malgalad's grandson became the king of Lorien, and the last king because he didn't have an heir before he died, waiting for Nimrodel. Just an aside, I know that Nimrodel and the Amroth is supposed to be like this tragic romantic story. She literally stoned out at a waterfall. Oh, pretty. I don't know. Nimrodel. This essay continues. A long peace followed in which the numbers of the Silvan Elves grew again, but they were unquiet and anxious, feeling the change in the world that the Third Age would bring. Men were also increasing in numbers and in power. The dominion of the Númenórean kings of Gondor was reaching out northward towards the borders of Lorien and the Greenwood. The free men of the north, so called by the elves because they were not under the rule of the Dunedain, and had not, for the most part, been subjected by Sauron or his servants, were spreading southward, mostly east of the Greenwood, though some were establishing themselves in the eaves of the forest and the grasslands of the Vales of Anduin. More ominous were rumors from the further east. The wild men were ruthless, former servants and worshippers of Sauron. They were released now from his tyranny, but not from the evil and darkness that he had set in their hearts. Cruel wars raged among them, from which some were withdrawing westward, with minds filled with hatred, regarding all that dwelt in the west as enemies to be slain and plundered. But there was, in Thranduil's heart, a still deeper shadow. He had seen the horror of Mordor and could not forget it. If ever he looked south, and its memory dimmed the light of the sun. And though he knew that it was now broken and deserted and under the vigilance of the kings of men, fear spoke in his heart that it was not conquered forever. It would rise again. In another passage written at the same time as the foregoing, it is said that when 1,000 years of the Third Age had passed and the shadow fell upon Greenwood the Great, the Silvan Elves, ruled by Thranduil, retreated before it as it spread ever northward, until at last Thranduil established his realm in the northeast of the forest and delved there a fortress and great halls underground. Oropher was of Sindarin origin, and no doubt Thranduil, his son, was following the example of King Thingol long ago in Doriath, though his halls were not to be compared to Menegroth. He had not the arts, nor the wealth, nor the aid of the dwarves, and compared with the elves of Doriath, his sylvan folk were rude and rustic. Oropher had come among them with only a handful of Sindar, and they were soon merged with the Silvan Elves, adopting their language and taking names of Sylvan form and style. This they did deliberately, for they and other similar adventurers forgotten in the legends and only briefly named, came from Doriath after its ruin, and had no desire to leave Middle-earth, nor to be merged with the other Sindar of Beleriand, dominated by the Noldor exiles, for whom the folk of Doriath had no great love. They wished indeed to become Sylvan folk and not to return, and as they said, to the simple life natural to the elves before the invitation of the Valar had disturbed it. So, yeah, the Valar, they didn't appreciate that. You heard. Nowhere, I believe, is it made clear how the adoption of the Sylvan speech by the Sindarin rulers of the Silvan Elves of Mirkwood, as described here, is to be related to the statement cited earlier that by the end of the Third Age, Silvan Elvish had ceased to be spoken in Thranduil's realm. See further note 14 in Disaster of Gladden Fields. I am not doing Gladden Fields today. Okay, I got three more appendices. In Appendix A to The Lord of the Rings, the Kingdom of Gondor, at the summit of its power in the days of King Hang on, the pronunciation, that's the problem. Hjarmendisil the first. Hjarmendisil. Like there's a cadence to saying the names, that's the thing. Is said to have extended northwards to Celeborn and the southern eaves of Mirkwood. This my father stated several times to be in error. The correct reading should be to the field of Celeborn. According to his late writing on the interrelations of the languages of Middle-earth, the river Celeborn, or Silverlode, was within the borders of the realm of Lorien, and the effective bounds of the kingdom of Gondor in the north, west of Anduin, was the river Limelight. The whole of the grasslands between Silverlode and Limelight, into which the woods of Lorien formerly extended further south, were known in Lorien as Parth Celebrant, as in, i.e., the field or enclosed grassland of Silverlode, and regarded as part of its realm, though not inhabited by its elvish folk beyond the eaves of the woods. In later days, Gondor built a bridge upon the upper Limelight, and often occupied the narrow land between the lower Limelight and Anduin as part of its eastern defenses, since the great loops of the Anduin, where it came down swiftly past Lorien and entered low, flat lands before its descent again into the chasm of the Amin Muil, had many shallows and wide shoals over which a determined and well-equipped enemy could force a crossing by rafts and pontoons, especially in the two westward bends, known as the North and South Undeeps. It was to this land that the name Parth Celebrant was applied in Gondor, hence its use in defining the ancient northern boundary. In the time of the War of the Ring, when all the land north of the White Mountain save Anorion, as far as the Limelight, had become part of the kingdom of Rohan, the name Parth, meaning field of, Celebrant, was only used of the great battle in which Eorl the Young destroyed the invaders of Gondor, which is when which, I'll continue, but Eorl came down from the south, or from the north, to aid Gondor. Forgetting the Círdan. Dang it, I'm gonna be mad. His name should be in here. Eorl came to the aid of Cirion, and in the early Third Age, and began the friendship of Rohan and Gondor, and that's why the beacons were made. The beacons of Amondine are lit. Hey, it's all connected. In another essay, my father noted that whereas east and west the land of Lorien was bounded by Anduin and by the mountains, and he says nothing about any extension of the realm of Lorien across the Anduin. It has no clearly defined borders northward and southward. Of old, the Galadrim had claimed to govern the woods as far as the falls of the Silverlode, where Frodo was bathed. Southward, it had extended far beyond the Silverlode into more open woodland of smaller trees that merged into Fangorn Forest, though the heart of the realm had always been in the angle between Silverlode and Anduin, where Caras Galadon stood. There were no visible borders between Lorien and Fangorn, but neither the Ents nor the Galadrim ever passed them. For legend reported that Fangorn himself had met with the king of the Galadrim in ancient days, and Fangorn had said, hang on, let me get my best Treebeard voice, because, Treebeard is Fangorn. Fangorn Forest is the Treebeard Forest. I know thee, and you know yours. Let neither side molest what is the other's. But if an elf should wish to walk in my land for his pleasure, he will be welcome. And if an Ent should be seen in your land, fear no evil. That's my worst Ent voice ever. I can't do my Ent voice anymore. I used to have such a good Ent voice. Long years had passed, however, since Ent or Elf had set foot in the other land. Okay, Appendix D. The Port of Londare. It was told concerning Galadriel and Celeborn that in the war against Sauron in Eriador, at the end of the 17th century of the Second Age, hang on, I need a drink after this sentence, the Númenorian admiral Siriatur put a strong force ashore at the mouth of the Gwathlo, or Grey Flood, where there was a small Númenorian harbor. This seems to be the first reference to the port, of which a good deal is told in later writings. The fullest account in this is in the philosophical essay concerning the names of rivers, which had already been cited in connection with the legend of Amroth and Nimrodel. In this essay, the name Gwathlo is discussed as follows. Okay, Gwathlo can be discussed after I take a drink. Okay. Or two. Stay hydrated, kids. Oh, okay. Okay, Gwathlo. The river Gwathlo is translated Grey Flood. The Gwath is a Sindarin word for shadow, in the sense of dim light, owing to cloud or mist, or in deep valleys. This does not seem to fit the geography. The wide lands divided by the Gwathlo into the regions called by the Númenóreans Minhiriath, between the rivers such as Baranduin and Gwathlo, and Enetwaith, Middlefolk, were mainly plains, open and mountainless. At the point of the confluence of Glanduin and Mithaethel, or Horwell, the land was almost flat. The waters became sluggish and tended to spread into fenland. Okay, there's a postscript note for Glanduin, apparently. The Glanduin, or border river, flowed down from the Misty Mountains south of Moria to join the Mithaethel above Tharbad. On the original map of the Lord of the Rings, the name was not marked. It only occurs once in the book, in Appendix A. It seems that in 1969 my father communicated to Miss Pauline Baines certain additional names for inclusion in her decorated map of Middle-earth. Ethelond, referred to above, Androst, Druath, Iar, I-A-U-R, how do you pronounce it? Iar. Druath, Iar, Old Pukeland. Laundair, Ruins. Erenvorn, Aridorn, the River Adorn, Swanfleet, and the River Glanduin. The last three of these names were then written into the original map that accompanies the book, but why this was done I have been unable to discover. But while the River Adorn is correctly placed, Swanfleet and River Glandun are blunderingly placed against the upper course of the Isen. For the correct interpretation of the relation between the names Glanduin and Swanfleet, I guess that's coming up. Alright, so, yeah. Pauline Baines kind of screwed that up then, I guess. But some 100 miles below Tharbad, the slope increased. The Gwathlo, however, never became swift, and the ships of smaller draught could without difficulty sail or be rowed as far as Tharbad. The origin of the name Gwathlo must be sought in history. In the time of the War of the Ring, the lands were still in places well wooded, especially in Minhiriath and in the southeast Enedwaith, but most of the plains were grasslands. Since the great plague of the year 1636 in the Third Age, Minhiriath had been almost entirely deserted, though a few secretive hunter folk lived in the woods. In Enedwaith, the remnants of the Dunlendings lived in the east, in the foothills of the Misty Mountains, and a fairly numerous but barbarous fisherfolk dwelt between the mouths of the Guathlo and the Angren, or Eisen. But in the early days, at the time of the first explorations of the Númenóreans, the situation was quite different. Minhiriath and Enedwaith were occupied by vast and almost continuous forests, except in the central region of the Great Fens. The changes that followed were largely due to the operations of the Tar Aldarian, the Mariner King, who formed a friendship and alliance with Gilgalad. Aldarian had a great hunger for timber, desiring to make Númenor into a great naval power. His felling of trees in Númenor had caused great dissension. In voyages down the coasts he saw with wonder the great forests, and chose the estuary of the Guathlo for the site of a new haven entirely under Númenorian control. Gondor, of course, did not yet exist. There he began great works that continued to be extended after his days. This entry into Eriador later proved of great importance in the war against Sauron in the Second Age, 1693 to 1701. But it was in origin a timber port and shipbuilding harbor. The native people were fairly numerous and warlike, but they were forest dwellers, scattered communities without central leadership. They were in awe of the Númenóreans, but they did not become hostile until the tree felling became devastating. Then they attacked and ambushed the Númenóreans when they could, and the Númenóreans treated them as enemies, and became ruthless in their fellings, giving no thought to husbandry or replanting. The fellings had at first been along both banks of the Guathlo, and timber had been floated down to the haven, Londare. But now Númenóreans drove great tracks and roads into the forests northwards and southwards from the Guathlo, and the native folk that survived fled from Minhiriath into the dark woods of the great keep of Erenvorn, south of the mouth of the Baranduin, which they dared not cross, even if they could, for fear of the elven folk. From Enedwaith they took refuge in the eastern mountains, where afterwards was Dunland. They did not cross the Eisen, nor take refuge in the great promontory between Eisen and Lefnui that formed in the north arm of the Bay of Belfalas, Ras Morthil or Androst, because of the Pukelmen. For the continuation of this passage, see page 495. 495. What is 495? The book's split into different ages, so. Yeah, a story about the Druidane, which of course are like the men of that period. Right. Okay. Anyway, back to, the Lorien relevant stuff. Devastation wrought by the Númenóreans was incalculable. For long years, these lands were their chief source of timber, but not only for their shipyards of Londare and elsewhere, but also for Númenor itself. Shiploads innumerable passed west over the sea. The denuding of the lands was increased during the war in Eriador, for the exiled natives welcomed Sauron and hoped for his victory over the men of the sea. Sauron knew of the importance of his enemies of the great haven and its shipyards, and he used these haters of Númenor as spies and guides for his raiders. He had not enough force to spare for any assault upon the forts at the haven or along the banks of the Guathlo, but his raiders made much havoc on the fringe of the forests, setting fire to the woods and burning many of the great wood stores of the Númenóreans. When Sauron was at last defeated and driven east out of Eriador, most of the old forests had been destroyed. The Guathlo flowed through the land that was far and wide on either bank of desert, treeless but untilled. That was not so when it first received its name from the hardy explorers of Tar Aldarian's ship, who ventured to pass up the river in small boats. As soon as the seaward region of salt airs and great winds was past, the forest drew down in the river banks, and wide though the waters were, the huge trees cast great shadows on the river, under which the boats of the adventurers crept silently up into the unknown land. So the first name they gave it was River of Shadow, Gwathir or Gwathir. But later they penetrated northward as far as the beginning of the great fenlands, though it was still long before they had the need or sufficient men to undertake the great works of drainage and dike building that made a great port of the site that where Tharbad stood in the days of the two kingdoms. The Sindarin word that they used for the fenland was lo, earlier loga, forming a stern log, meaning wet, soaked, swampy. And they thought at first that it was the source of the forest river, not yet knowing that Mithathil, that knowing the Mithathil that came down out of the river, out of the mountains in the north, and gathering the waters of the Bruinen, Loudwater, and Glanduin, poured flood waters into the plain. The name Gwathir was thus changed to Gwathlo, the shadowy river from the fens. The Gwathlo was one of the few geographical names that became generally known to others than mariners in Numenor and received an Andunic translation. This was Agathurush. I swear, Andunaic is even more complicated than Sindarin or Equenia. The history of Londare and Tharbad is also mentioned in this same essay in the discussion of the name Glanduin. Okay, this is still under the history of Galadriel and Celeborn for what it's worth. So, but I'm almost there. Like 5 pages away. Glanduin means border river. It was the name given in this. Wait, did I skip? No. In the Second Age, since the river was the southern boundary of the region, beyond which the pre-Numenorian and generally unfriendly people lived, such as the ancestors of the Dunlendings. Later, it, with the Gwethlo formed by its confluence with the Mithathil, formed the southern boundary of the North Kingdom. The land beyond, between the Gwathlo and the Eisen, or Sir Angrin, was called Enedwaith, or Middlefolk. It belonged to neither kingdom and received no permanent settlements of men of Numenorian origin. But the great north-south road, which was the chief route of communication between the two kingdoms except by sea, ran through it from Tharbad to the fords of Eisen, Ethrade, Engrin. Before the decay of the North Kingdom and the disasters that befell Gondor, indeed until the coming of the Great Plague in the Third Age, 1636, both kingdoms shared an interest in this region, and together built and maintained the bridge of Tharbad and the long causeway that carried the road to it on either side of the Gwathlo and Mithathil across the fens in the plains of Minhiriath and Enedwaith. And another postscript, or footnote, I guess. In the early days of the kingdom, the most expeditious route from one to the other, except for great armaments, was found to be by sea to the ancient port at the head of the estuary of the Gwathlo, and so to the river port of Tharbad, and thence by the road. The ancient seaport and its great quays were ruinous, and with long labor a port capable of receiving seagoing vessels had been made at Tharbad, and a fort raised there on great earthworks on both sides of the river, to guard the once famed bridge of Tharbad. The ancient port was one of the earliest ports of the Numenorians, begun by the renowned mariner king Tar Aldarian, and later enlarged and fortified. It was called Londare and Enave, the great middle haven, as being between Linden in the north and Pelargir on the Anduin. Yeah, Pelargir is like where think the Corsairs were coming in through there, and Aragorn stopped them with the dead army there. A considerable garrison of soldiers, mariners, and engineers had been kept there until the 17th century of the Third Age. But from then onwards, the region fell quickly into decay, and long before the time of the Lord of the Rings had gone back into wild fenlands. When Boromir made his great journey from Gondor to Rivendell, the courage and hardihood required is not fully recognized in the narrative. The north-south road no longer existed except for the crumbling remains of the causeways, by which a hazardous approach to Tharbad might be achieved, only to find ruins on dwindling mounds, and a dangerous ford formed by the ruins of the bridge, impassable if the river had not been there slow and shallow, but wide. If the name Glanduin was remembered at all, it would only be in Rivendell, and it would apply only to the upper course of the river, where it still ran swiftly, soon to be lost in the plains and disappear in the fens. A network of swamps, pools, eyots, where the only inhabitants were hosts of swans and many other water birds. If the river had any name, it was in the language of the Dunlendings. In The Return of the King, Book 6, Chapter 6, it is called the Swanfleet River, not Capital River, simply as being a river that went down into Nin and Ilf, the waterlands of the swans. Postscript here. Sindarin Alf, a swan, plural Ilf. Quenya Alqua, as in Alquilonde. The Sindarin branch of Eldarin shifted original KW to P, but original P remained unshifted. The much-changed Sindarin of Middle-earth turned to stops to spirants after L and R. Thus original Alqua became Alpa in Telerin, and Alf transcribed ALPH in Sindarin. It was my father's intention to enter in a revised map of the Lord of the Rings Glanduin as the name of the upper course of the river, and to mark the fens as such, with the name Nin in Ilf, or Swanfleet. In the event his intention came to be misunderstood, for on Pauline Bain's map the lower course is marked the R Swanfleet, while on the map in the book, as noted above, the names are placed against the wrong river. Oh man, Pauline Bain's like 50 years later. Shame. I probably would have screwed it up too. Let's be real here. Well, I don't know. Would I? I don't know. It may be noted that Tharbad is referred to as a ruined town in the Fellowship of the Ring, Book 2, Chapter 3, and that Boromir in Lothlorien told that he lost his horse at Tharbad, at the fording of the Grey Flood. In the Tale of Years, the ruining and desertion of Tharbad is dated to the year 2912 of the Third Age, when great floods devastated Enetwaith and Minhiriath. From these discussions, it can be seen that the conception of the Númenórean harbour at the mouth of the Gwathlo had been expanded since the time when Concerning Galadriel and Celeborn was written, from a small Númenórean harbour to Londare, the Great Haven. It is, of course, the Vignalonde, or New Haven, of Aldarion and Erendis, though that name does not appear in the discussions just cited. It is said in Aldarion and Erendis that the works that Aldarion began again at Vignalonde after he became king were never completed. This probably means no more than that they were never completed by him, for the later history of Londare presupposes that the haven was at length restored and made secure for the assaults of the sea. And indeed, the same passage in Eldarion and Erendis goes on to say that Eldarion laid the foundation for the achievement of Tar Minastir long years after, in the first war with Sauron. But for his works, the fleets of Numenor could not have brought their power in time to the right place as he foresaw. The statement in the discussion of Glanduin above that the port was called Londare and Enave, the great middle haven, as being between the havens of Lindon in the north and Pelargir in the Anduin, must refer to a time long after the Númenórean intervention in the war against Sauron in Eriador. For according to the Tale of Years, Pelargir was not built until the year 2350 of the Second Age, and became the chief haven of the faithful Númenóreans. Alright, last appendix. Appendix E, the names of Celeborn and Galadriel. It is said in an essay concerning the customs of name-giving among the Eldar in Valinor that they had two given names, or Isai, of which the first was given at birth by the father, and this one usually recalled by the father's own name, resembling it in form, in sense or form, or might even be actually the same as the father's, to which some distinguishing prefix might be added later, when the child was full grown. The second name was given later, sometimes much later, and sometimes soon after the birth, by the mother. And these mother names had great significance, for the mothers of the Eldar had insight into the characters and abilities of their children, and many also had the gift of prophetic foresight. In addition, any of the Eldar might acquire the epesse, after-name, not necessarily given by their own kin, a nickname, mostly given as a title of admiration or honor, and an epesse might become the name generally used and recognized in later song and history, as was the case, for instance, with Ereinion, always known by his epesse Gil-galad. Thus the name Elatariel, which, according to the late version of the story and their relationship, was given to Galadriel by Celeborn in Aman, was an epesse. For its etymology, see the appendix in the Silmarillion, entry Cal, which she chose to use in Middle-earth, rendered into Sindarin as Galadriel. So Alatriel was the name that Celeborn gave her. Alatriel became Galadriel. Rather than her father name, Artanis, or her mother name, Nerwin. It is only, of course, in the late version of that Celeborn appears with a High Elven rather than Sindarin name, Teleporno. This is stated to be actually Telerin in form. The ancient stem of the Elvish word for silver was Kielip, becoming Keleb, and Sindarin, Telip or Tilp in Telerin, meaning, or in Telerin, and Telip and Tilip in Quenya. But in Quenya, the form Tilp became usual through the influence of Telerin, for the Telerin prized silver above gold, and their skill as silversmiths was esteemed even by the Noldor. Thus, Telperion was more commonly used than Tailfarion as the name of the white tree of Valinor. Alatriel was also Telerin. Its Quenya form is Altariel. The name Celeborn was first devised was intended to mean silver tree. It was also the name of the tree of Tol Eressëa in the Silmarillion. Celeborn's close kin had tree names. Galadon, his father, Galadhil, his brother, and Nimloth his niece, who bore the same name as the White Tree of Numenor. In my father's latest philosophical writings, however, the meaning Silver Tree was abandoned. The second element of Celeborn, as the name of a person, was derived from the ancient adjectival form orna, uprising or tall, rather than from the related noun orne, tree. Orne was originally applied to straighter or more slender trees such as birches, whereas stouter, more spreading trees such as oaks and beeches were called in the ancient language Galada, great growth. But this distinction was not always observed in Quenya and disappeared in Sindarin, where all trees came to be called Galad, and Orn fell out of the common use, surviving only in verse and songs in many names, both of persons and of trees. That Celeborn was tall is mentioned in a note to the discussion of Numenorian linear measures. Page 371. That is in Disaster of Gladden Fields. That is not for today. Great, almost done. On occasional confusion of Galadriel's name with the word Galath, my father wrote, when Celeborn and Galadriel became the rulers of the Elves of Lorien, who were mainly in origin Silvan Elves and called themselves the Galadrim, the name of Galadriel became associated with trees, as an association that was aided by the name of her husband, which also appeared to contain a tree word, so that outside Lorien, among those whose memories of the ancient days of Galadriel's history had grown dim, her name was often altered to Galadriel, not in Lorien itself. Galadriel. It's a DH, so Galadriel. It may be mentioned here that Galadrim is the correct spelling of the name of the Elves of Lorien, and similarly Caras Galadhon. My father originally altered the voiced form of TH, as in modern English then. Yeah, I told you. Modern English names to D, since, as he wrote, DH is not used in English and looks uncouth. Afterwards, he changed his mind on the point, but Galadrim and Caras Galadhon remained uncorrected until after the appearance of the revised edition of Lord of the Rings. In recent reprints, the change has been made. These names are wrongly spelt in the entry Alda in the appendix of the Silmarillion. And there you have that. The history of Galadriel and Celeborn. So, final thoughts, or words, or whatever. I just want to go into the... do I want to go to the Battles of Tolkien for this? Yeah, he gives a good... David Day gives a good description. It's to the point about it. So this is Part 3, Second Age, War of the Elves and Numenorians. War of Sauron and the Elves. Between the dates 1693 and 1701, Second Age. Location, Eriador. Just as Tolkien once observed that the history of the elves of the First Age were linked to the fate and significance of the three Silmarilli jewels, so we see that this theme recur in the history of the elves and men of the Second and Third Ages, which were linked to the fate of the significance of the Rings of Power, also forged by the elves. Further parallels can be drawn between the two stories, as Tolkien's chosen chief protagonist among the elves of this age was Celebrimbor, the grandson of Fëanor, who forged the Silmarils. In Prometheus, the good titan of Greek mythology who brought fire and light to the human race, we have a mirror opposite of Tolkien's Sauron, the evil sorcerer who brought death and darkness. However, in the Second Age, when Melkor's former lieutenant appeared in disguise as the mysterious Annatar, the Lord of Gifts, among the elven smiths of Eregion, he must have seemed to the elves anything that Prometheus was to humans. For Annatar was a magician-smith who, like Prometheus, defied the gods and gave to them the great gift of forbidden knowledge and skills, and for quite different purposes. With Annatar's guidance, Celebrimbor and the elven smiths of Ostinethil in Eregion learned skills of forge and fire only matched by the Vala Yule, the smith. Only after the forging of the Rings of Power did the elves learn the terrible price of Annatar's gifts. While in Greek mythology Prometheus' gifts were freely given, Annatar's gift of the Rings of Power would ultimately result in enslavement to the terrible Lord of the Rings. So, yeah, that paints the picture. I doubt, in my opinion. Okay, final thoughts. This has to be a story about redemption. Obviously. Gandalf can't be in this, obviously, because Gandalf didn't come until the Third Age. Will they go into Amroth and Nimrodel? I don't know. It's possible. I think it'll more focus on, obviously, Celebrimbor, Durin's folk, Celeborn's disdain for the elves. Maybe the relationship between Galadriel and Celeborn, although Celeborn plays a more passive role. He may be he serve as like a sort of conscience for her, probably, because because he's Teleri, and the Teleri were the ones who the Noldor slaughtered to get their ships to get the Silmarils when they were exiled. So there is a when Galadriel is wishing she wasn't exiled, there can be a reflection of that grief to reassure her with Celeborn. I hope they don't get rid of Celeborn altogether. I'm very curious about what they do with Celeborn loving Galadriel, and the uprising in Annatar, and the Silvan Elves as well, getting along with the Silvan Elves who they inherently think are lesser. They kind of are, to a degree. Not lesser, I should say, just, they denied the journey, to Valar. I'm assuming a lot of pre-knowledge of Tolkien lore with this. So, anyways, that will do it, and I am cautiously optimistic. I don't care about the politics of the show. I don't care about, again, the only thing that elves, if there is a beard on an elf, I'll be upset. If there is a black elf, I don't care. If there is a black dwarf, I don't care. I'm shocked that there wouldn't be different races in Middle-earth. People travel, especially with such long lifetimes. You'd think the elves would just chill out and play Pong all the time, never travel. They travel a lot. Even the highest authorities like Galadriel and Celeborn and Elrond, Celebrian, they travel. You know, they're not um, posturing lords. You know, they go places. So if the highest authorities of elven society are okay with just walking and traveling places or riding places, you don't think that normal people would, and normal people wouldn't be in different parts of the world? Hell, Silvan Elves would be who would be the perfect candidates to, like, the people who rejected the journey would be of any race. Maybe not. Maybe Noldor wouldn't. Even Noldor, really, if they traveled south, but it would depend on if they would. I don't think they would, but like Sylvan Elves are perfect candidates to be of different ethnicities in the show. Um, and it's not like that. Also, people are upset about the black female black dwarf. Again, I don't know what they're gonna do with her, but there was an actual one of the um a one of Durin's descendants. I don't have the Return of the King with me right here, but they if you look at the Durin's folk genealogy, the family tree, there is a dwarf lord who is a lady. There is a dwarf lady who is the highest authority for a large duration of dwarven society. So there's a lot they can sink their teeth into with this show. Um, they Galadriel, I don't see how they'll screw up Galadriel. What I'm worried about is how they present Sauron. They butchered Sauron in the Hobbit with the necromancers, like Sauron when they went on the Dol Guldur raid. Dol Guldur they just walk into, while instead of it being like this huge um it was like a hill. It was I think that at the end of the day, Amundine or Weathertop, Amonsul was more threatening and big than Dol Guldur was. And Dol Guldur is like Minas Tirith big. So I don't know. Anyway, that's me. I'll let you know what I think of episode 1, and I'll do one episode a day. And I won't go on as long as this because I'll probably not have as much to say about each episode, but I will be excited. And I want to know if anyone else is excited for Lord of the Rings content, because I have a lot of Tolkien I can get into. I hope I'm not dry, I'm not boring, but there's so much you can sink your teeth into with Middle-earth beyond the show or the game. The games are fine, but the books, and I'm thinking about sharing Merp with everybody, and David Day's content, or not like share it outright. I mean, I've read that just a little bit, but David Day, get his books. That the he has like a box set of Tolkien books, like describing like the different things in Middle Earth. If you care about Middle Earth lore to any extent, those books are a treasure trove. I can't recommend them enough. Anywho, goodbye everyone, and happy outro.